Derbyshire, England, November 1819. The wind that night carried more than the scent of approaching winter through the stone corridors of Westshire Hall. It carried secrets, whispered through keyholes and under doorways, clinging like frost to every surface it touched. In the servants' quarters, candles burned low while maids exchanged furtive glances, and footmen shook their heads in silent disapproval. Something was amiss in the great house, something that had been growing like mold in darkness for 9 long months. In the Duchess's private chambers, Lady Aurelia Grayson stood before her Venetian looking-glass, while Fiona Blackwell, her lady's maid, secured the final pins in her platinum blonde hair. The reflection showed 2 women, one blessed with every advantage society could bestow, the other cursed with seeing those blessings every waking moment. Aurelia's gentle blue eyes met Fiona's jade-green gaze in the mirror, and she smiled with the unconscious warmth of someone who had never learned to suspect malice. Had she but known the darkness fermenting behind that dutiful expression, the hatred so carefully masked beneath years of practiced civility, perhaps the tragedy to come might have been averted. If stories of betrayal, loyalty, and the dangerous line between kindness and blindness move your heart, subscribe now. What unfolds tonight will change everything. The poison had not been administered in a single dose. Like arsenic stirred into tea over months, Fiona Blackwell's transformation from servant to schemer had been gradual, invisible, until the damage penetrated too deep for remedy. 9 months prior, on a crystalline February morning, Aurelia had arrived at Westshire Hall as the 24-year-old bride of Damien Grayson, Duke of Westshire. The carriage that delivered her seemed to carry not just a new duchess, but also every insecurity that came from being orphaned at 16 and raised by relatives who made no secret of viewing her as a financial burden they could scarcely tolerate. The estate overwhelmed her senses completely. Westshire Hall sprawled across 300 acres of Derbyshire countryside, its Portland stone facade gleaming like frozen sunlight. Inside, corridors seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes followed her judgmentally. 47 servants staffed the household, each with specific duties she could not begin to fathom. The silver service alone required its own butler to maintain. The linen cupboards contained sheets she could not name. The rules of precedence governing dinners left her paralyzed with anxiety. "Your Grace," the elderly Dowager Duchess, Damien's mother, had said that first evening, observing Aurelia's trembling hands as she attempted to navigate the array of forks at dinner. "You require a lady's maid of superior capability, someone who understands the demands of your position." "Mother suggested Fiona Blackwell," Damien had explained later, as they sat in the library warming themselves by the fire. His grey eyes held concern for his overwhelmed bride. "She has served the family for 3 years as a housemaid. Mother believes she has the intelligence and discretion for advancement." Aurelia had met Fiona the following morning in her private chambers. The interview remained etched in memory, with the clarity of things that in retrospect should have served as warnings. Fiona had entered the room with a housemaid's diffidence, her red-brown hair severely pinned beneath a mob cap, her gaze downcast in appropriate humility. She wore the plain grey dress of lower servants, her hands reddened from the harsh lye soap used for scrubbing floors. "Your Grace," she had murmured, sinking into a perfect curtsy. "Please, rise," Aurelia had said, her voice gentle with understanding, born from her own experiences of being made to feel lesser. "I am new to all of this myself, Fiona. I confess I am quite overwhelmed. The Dowager Duchess speaks highly of your capabilities." For a moment, something flickered across Fiona's features. Was it surprise? Hope? Calculation? Years later, Aurelia would remember that flicker and recognize it for what it truly was. But in that moment, desperate for any kindness in the overwhelming grandeur of her new life, she saw only an opportunity for the friendship she had always craved. "I would work very hard to prove worthy of your Grace's trust," Fiona had replied, her voice carrying the precise inflection of grateful servitude. "More than that," Aurelia had continued, stepping closer with the earnestness of someone too young and too lonely to recognize the dangers of blurring social boundaries. "I do hope we might become something like friends. I have had so few in my life, you see. I was passed from relative to relative after my parents died, never staying anywhere long enough to form true connections. This place is so large and formal, and I am quite lost in it all." The words had spilled from her lips like a confession, the admission of vulnerability that should have been reserved for equals, not shared with servants whose station demanded entirely different relationships. But Aurelia, in her desperate isolation, could not recognize the fundamental error she was committing. Years of being treated as a financial burden had taught her that affection must be purchased, in this case with trust and kindness, given without measure. She was not seeking a friend. She was desperately attempting to validate her own existence through the first face that showed her any courtesy, mistaking Fiona's servitude for potential affection. Fiona's expression had shifted, a mask of gratitude sliding smoothly into place. "Your grace is too kind, far too kind." "Then it is settled," Aurelia had declared with relief. "You shall be my lady's maid and my friend if you will have it so." Too kind. The words would echo through the months ahead with prophetic irony. What Aurelia experienced as the joy of finding companionship, Fiona endured as daily humiliation. Every morning began the same way. Fiona would rise at 5 from her narrow bed in the cramped servants' quarters on the 4th floor, where ice formed on the inside of windows during winter and summer heat, turned the space into an airless oven. She would dress in the simple cotton chemise and plain wool dress that marked her station, draw water from the servants' cistern, and make herself presentable enough to attend to a duchess's intimate needs. By 7, she would be in Aurelia's chambers, opening curtains to admit morning light across silk sheets that cost more than Fiona earned in 6 months. She would help her mistress from a 4-poster bed carved from mahogany and dressed with linens so fine they seemed to float rather than drape. She would assist Aurelia into undergarments of embroidered cambric, gowns of figured silk, kid leather gloves, softer than a whisper. All while Aurelia chattered away like a friend, rather than a duchess giving orders to a servant, completely oblivious to how each word of easy intimacy ground like salt into wounds she did not know she was inflicting. "What think you of this blue morning dress, Fiona?" Aurelia would ask, holding up a gown that cost more than Fiona's annual wages. "Is it not becoming? Oh, but perhaps the rose silk would be better for my walk in the gardens with His Grace." "Both are lovely, Your Grace," Fiona would reply, her voice carefully neutral, while the bitter calculation formed in her mind. How differently life might have unfolded had she been born into even a fraction of such privilege. "Do call me Aurelia when we are private," the Duchess would insist, seemingly unaware that such familiarity only emphasized the vast chasm between their positions rather than bridging it. "After all, we are friends, are we not?" Friends. The word was bitter ash on her tongue. How could they be friends when every interaction was defined by the fundamental inequality of their positions? When Aurelia slept in luxury, while Fiona returned each night to a room she shared with 2 housemaids, where the straw mattress offered little protection against wooden slats that left bruises. When Aurelia chose between a dozen gowns, while Fiona owned 3 dresses, one of which was reserved for Sundays. When Aurelia's smallest piece of jewelry could have purchased Fiona's freedom. From service entirely. But Fiona had learned young the art of presenting the face expected, while hiding truths too dangerous to reveal. She smiled. She agreed. She played the role of grateful confidant, while, beneath the surface, something dark and bitter began to germinate. The first seeds of active sabotage were planted in April, 3 months after Fiona's promotion. Aurelia had received a new riding habit from London, a magnificent creation of deep, forest green velvet, with military-style frogging in gold. She had been so excited to wear it for a morning ride with the Duke that she could speak of little else for days. His Grace rarely has time for leisure, what with managing the estate and his duties in Parliament, Aurelia had confided to Fiona as the maid brushed her hair before bed. But tomorrow he has promised me an entire morning. We shall ride to the old ruins on the northern boundary. I do hope the weather holds. The next morning, when Aurelia went to don the new habit, she discovered that the hem had been mysteriously shredded, as though someone had taken scissors to the expensive fabric in irregular, devastating cuts. The riding appointment had to be cancelled, while seamstresses scrambled to repair the damage, a task that took 3 days, by which time the Duke had departed for London on estate business. "How dreadful!" Fiona had exclaimed, her face a picture of shocked dismay as she examined the ruined garment. "It must have caught on something in the wardrobe. How careless of me not to hang it more carefully. Your Grace, I am terribly sorry." "It was not your fault," Aurelia had assured her, fighting back tears of disappointment. "These things happen. Do not distress yourself so." But it had been Fiona's fault, of course. In the dead of night, seized by a rage she could barely name, she had crept back into the Duchess's chambers and methodically destroyed the riding habit that represented yet another thing Aurelia possessed without appreciation. The satisfaction had been brief but intoxicating, a moment of power in a life defined by powerlessness. After that first act of sabotage, the rest came easier. In May, a pair of antique sapphire earrings, heirlooms passed down through 4 generations, vanished from Aurelia's jewel case. The Duchess was distraught, convinced they had been lost or stolen by unknown parties. A thorough investigation of all servants turned up nothing. How could it when Fiona had simply tucked them into her own meager possessions, hidden in a pocket of her second-best dress? She never wore them, of course. What use had she for sapphires, when her sole social occasions were the brief hours of freedom on Sunday afternoons? But possessing them, knowing Aurelia searched desperately for them while they rested in Fiona's room mere floors above, provided a dark satisfaction that temporarily eased the constant ache of envy. "They were my grandmother's," Aurelia had wept to Fiona, as the maid helped her prepare for bed after a day of fruitless searching. "The only things I have from her. She died when I was so young, and these earrings, they made me feel connected to her, you understand?" "Of course, Your Grace," Fiona had murmured, her voice heavy with false sympathy, while her fingers worked to unfasten the dress Aurelia wore. "Perhaps they will yet turn up." They would not, of course. Fiona had seen to that. Letters from London that never reached Aurelia's hands, carefully placed rumours in the servants' hall about the new Duchess being above herself or difficult to please, small tears in petticoats that required rushed mending before social engagements, cosmetics mysteriously spilled across dressing tables. And then there were the flowers. Once the Duke had picked for Aurelia a rare winter rose from the conservatory, one of only 3 blooms produced that season. Aurelia had pressed it carefully in her book of poems, planning to preserve it as a treasure. The next morning, she found it not merely crushed, but methodically torn into tiny pieces, an act of cruelty so petty, yet so profound, that she had wept without understanding why. The destruction was too deliberate to be accidental, yet who would commit such a senseless act of spite? Each act of sabotage was minor enough to seem like accident or misfortune, but together they formed a pattern of small torments that kept Aurelia slightly off balance, perpetually managing tiny crises that prevented her from settling comfortably into her role. Mrs. Brennan had served the Grayson family for 2 decades, rising from scullery maid to housekeeper through a combination of sharp observation, unfailing loyalty, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate household needs before they arose. At 52, her face bore the lines of a woman who had seen every variety of human nature the servants' quarters could produce. She knew the signs of discontent, recognized the subtle shifts in demeanor that preceded theft, and could sense scheming the way sailors sensed approaching storms. She had noticed Fiona Blackwell from the girls' first days at Westshire Hall 3 years prior. There had been something in those eyes, a calculating quality that belied the humble demeanor. Mrs. Brennan had kept Fiona in positions where close supervision was possible, always wary of what might emerge if proper oversight lapsed. When the Dowager Duchess suggested promoting Fiona to lady's maid for the new mistress, Mrs. Brennan had voiced her concerns privately. "Begging your Grace's pardon," she had said to the Dowager in the quiet of the housekeeper's parlour, where such frank discussions between upper servants and aristocracy could occur away from prying ears. "Miss Blackwell is capable, certainly, but I wonder if she possesses the proper temperament for such intimate service." "Whatever do you mean, Mrs. Brennan?" the Dowager had asked, her aristocratic features sharpening with interest. The old Duchess had not survived 60 years in the ton by ignoring the observations of trusted servants. "It is difficult to articulate, Your Grace. Nothing I could prove or specify, but there is a hardness about her, a resentment that surfaces in small ways. the manner in which she looks at the silver service when she thinks no one observes, the way her expression shifts when comparing her portion at the servants' table to what is served above stairs. I fear that daily proximity to luxury she cannot possess might prove difficult. The dowager had considered this seriously, for she was a woman who understood that the best intelligence often came from those who worked below stairs. But ultimately, other factors had weighed more heavily in her decision. The new Duchess requires someone intelligent and capable, she had concluded. Young Lady Aurelia comes to us quite overwhelmed by the demands of her position. Fiona has the skills needed. Perhaps the promotion will inspire loyalty and satisfaction rather than resentment. Besides, she had added with the pragmatic understanding of her class, it is always wiser to elevate those who might harbor grievances than to leave them in positions where resentment can fester unobserved. Mrs. Brennan had acquiesced, of course. One did not argue with duchesses, even dowager ones. But she had maintained her vigilance, watching Fiona with the careful attention of a gardener, monitoring a plant suspected of harboring blight. The small misfortunes that began to plague Lady Aurelia did not escape the housekeeper's notice. Mrs. Brennan had managed households too long to believe in coincidence, especially when misfortunes clustered suspiciously around a single person. She had been in the laundry when the ruined riding habit was discovered and had personally examined the damage. The cuts were too regular, too deliberate to have resulted from accidental snagging. When questioned, the laundress had sworn that the garment had arrived in perfect condition and hung thus overnight. Someone has taken scissors to this deliberately, Mrs. Brennan had muttered to herself, running experienced fingers along the destroyed hem. But who would do such a thing? Her suspicions had crystallized further with the missing sapphire earrings. She had supervised the search herself, meticulously checking every inch of the Duchess's chambers and questioning every servant who might have had access. The investigation revealed nothing, which itself was revealing. Thefts by outsiders left traces, forced locks, disturbed furnishings, rumors in the village. This disappearance had the hallmarks of an inside betrayal by someone familiar enough with the household to cover their tracks. "Your Grace," she had ventured one morning after the earrings incident, finding the Duchess alone in her private sitting room. "I wonder if I might speak plainly regarding household matters." Aurelia had looked up from her correspondence, her blue eyes still red-rimmed from tears shed over the lost heirlooms. "Of course, Mrs. Brennan. You have always been frank with me, which I appreciate. It concerns the recent difficulties you have experienced, the ruined garments, the missing jewelry, the various small misfortunes." Mrs. Brennan had chosen her words carefully, knowing she walked a delicate line between duty and potential accusation. "In my experience, when such things occur with regularity, they are rarely purely accidental." "What are you suggesting?" Aurelia had asked, though the very innocence in her voice suggested she could not conceive of deliberate malice. "I would suggest caution, milady, particularly regarding those who have greatest access to your private chambers and possessions." Understanding had dawned slowly across Aurelia's features. "You mean Fiona?" "Oh, Mrs. Brennan, surely not. She is devastated by each mishap. I have never seen someone more distressed by such accidents." "Distress is easily performed, Your Grace," the housekeeper had replied, her tone gentle but firm, "and sometimes those who appear most loyal harbor the deepest resentments." But Aurelia had shaken her head with the stubborn certainty of youth and inexperience. "You are mistaken. Fiona is my dear friend. She would never betray my trust so cruelly. I think perhaps you see shadows where none exist, Mrs. Brennan. You have been with this family so long that you have perhaps become overly suspicious of newcomers." The rebuke had been delivered kindly, but it had been a rebuke nonetheless. Mrs. Brennan had withdrawn with a curtsy, her concerns dismissed as the unfounded suspicions of an aging servant seeing conspiracies where only coincidence existed. She was trapped, and she knew it. Without irrefutable proof, and what proof could she provide beyond patterns of misfortune and her own instincts? Any further accusation against the Duchess's declared favorite would be professional suicide. It would be her word, that of a servant, against the young mistress's personal confidant. She would not merely be ignored, she would be dismissed, turned out without references after 20 years of loyal service. Her duty was to protect the household. but she could not do so if she was cast out. All she could manage was to watch, wait, and pray that the truth would reveal itself before the damage became irreparable. But she had not ceased her observations. If anything, they had intensified. She began noting Fiona's patterns with the methodical attention to detail that had made her exceptional at her position. The maid's mood fluctuated in direct correlation to the Duchess's happiness, darkening whenever Aurelia received particular attention from the Duke, brightening slightly when small misfortunes temporarily dimmed the young woman's natural radiance. Mrs. Brennan observed how Fiona's eyes followed the Duke with an intensity inappropriate for a servant, how her expression would harden when he displayed affection toward his wife. She noticed how the maid's hands would clench when Aurelia laughed without care, how Fiona's jaw would tighten when the Duchess thoughtlessly mentioned some new gown or jewel. Most tellingly, she noticed how Fiona had begun spending her limited free time in the library on the 4th floor, the servants' library, containing cast-off books from the main collection below. The volumes she selected were telling: Gothic romances featuring innocent governesses seduced by brooding masters, scandalous French novels about servants who became mistresses to aristocrats, even a battered copy of Pamela, that infamous tale of a servant girl who married her would-be seducer. "What does she imagine she is reading about?" Mrs. Brennan had asked Mr. Davies, the butler, one evening as they reviewed the day's events in the housekeeper's parlour. "Does she fancy herself the heroine of some romantic tale where the Duke will suddenly notice her charms?" Mr. Davies, a man of 60 with silver hair and the dignified bearing of one who had served 3 dukes, had frowned at the notion. "His Grace is utterly devoted to the Duchess. He scarce notices the female servants exist beyond their functions. Miss Blackwell would have better luck catching the moon than attracting his attention." "Precisely," Mrs. Brennan had agreed, her tone dark with foreboding. "Which makes her reading choices all the more concerning. A woman who knows her fantasies are impossible but indulges them anyway is capable of terrible things when reality fails to conform to imagination. Still, what could she do beyond watch and worry? Without proof of actual wrongdoing, she could hardly go to the Duke with vague concerns about a maid's reading habits and facial expressions. The best she could manage was to remain vigilant and hope that opportunity would arise to protect the Duchess from whatever storm was gathering. The catalyst for Fiona's darkest ambitions arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday evening in late October. Aurelia had been particularly animated at dinner, speaking of her charitable visits to the village, and afterward had asked Fiona to help her prepare for bed earlier than usual. "I am quite exhausted from today's activities," Aurelia had explained, as Fiona unbuttoned the back of her evening gown. "Tomorrow I must organize the household accounts with Mrs. Brennan, and then, in the evening, I shall visit poor Mrs. Miller in the village. The widow has taken a turn for the worse, I am told, and has no family to care for her." "How generous your Grace is with your time," Fiona had murmured automatically, her fingers working the tiny pearl buttons with practiced efficiency. "Oh, it is nothing," Aurelia had replied with the casual dismissal of someone who had never been denied anything she truly desired. "I visit her every Thursday evening now. It has become quite a regular appointment. His Grace thinks I am too soft-hearted, but he indulges me. He always waits for me in the library when I return, poor man. I think he worries that some harm might befall me on the journey, though it is scarcely 2 miles, and I take 2 footmen besides." The words had hung in the air like smoke, seemingly innocent, yet carrying the seeds of catastrophe. Fiona's hands had paused on the buttons as the implications crystallized in her mind with terrible clarity. Every Thursday evening, the Duchess departed for the village. The Duke waited alone in the library. Later, after Aurelia had been settled in her bed and Fiona had been dismissed for the night, the maid did not return immediately to her cramped quarters. Instead, she found herself wandering the darkened corridors of the great house, her mind churning with possibilities that both thrilled and horrified her. She had descended to the main floor and found herself outside the library door. Light seeped through the crack beneath, indicating the Duke remained within. Fiona had pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe, listening to the sounds of his solitary evening. The rustle of papers, the occasional clink of glass as he sipped brandy, the creak of his chair. How easy it would be, she had thought, to slip inside those doors. How simple to present herself to a man alone in dimness expecting his wife. The thought had been so shocking in its audacity that Fiona had actually gasped aloud, quickly covering her mouth lest someone hear. But once conceived, the idea proved impossible to dismiss. It grew in her imagination like some dark, twisted plant, sending roots deep into the fertile soil of her resentment. She could become Aurelia, if only for one night. She possessed access to the Duchess's clothing, her perfumes, her jewelry. She knew every detail of Aurelia's appearance and mannerisms. In darkness, with dim candlelight as her ally, could she not present a convincing impersonation? And if she succeeded, if just once she could experience what it meant to be desired as Aurelia was desired, to be held as Aurelia was held, might that not result in something permanent? A child, for instance, His Grace's child, conceived in deception but real nonetheless. The implications of such a pregnancy sent Fiona's imagination spiraling into fantasy. She would not be cast out as ruined, not if she possessed leverage. The Duke would be forced to provide for her, to set her up in a comfortable cottage with an income sufficient to maintain her and the child in genteel comfort. £200 a year, perhaps. Her own establishment free from service, with a son or daughter who carried aristocratic blood. And Aurelia, perfect, privileged Aurelia, would be forced to witness it all. Every quarter when the Duke arranged payments, every year when he made discreet visits to ensure his natural child's well-being, the Duchess would be reminded of her husband's infidelity, her own failure to satisfy him completely, the existence of another woman's child who bore his features. The sweetness of that revenge almost made Fiona dizzy with its perfection. Over the following days, the fantasy crystallized into something approaching an actual plan. Fiona began paying closer attention to the Duke's habits, noting when and where he spent his evenings. She observed that on Thursdays, he indeed retired to the library around 8 o'clock, dismissing servants and preferring solitude while awaiting his wife's return. She studied the library itself during her rare moments of freedom, noting its layout. The room was vast, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that gave it a particular musty, masculine scent of old paper and tobacco. A massive fireplace dominated one end, usually lit against the evening chill. The Duke's preferred location was a leather chair positioned behind an enormous mahogany desk near the fireplace, where he could review correspondence and estate documents by candlelight. Candlelight. That was crucial. The Duke kept only 3 or 4 candles burning during these sessions, preferring dimness that eased his eyes after long hours of reading. The far reaches of the library remained in shadow, lit only by flickering firelight that transformed everything into indistinct shapes and suggestions. In such conditions, with the right preparation, might deception succeed? Fiona began her preparations with meticulous care. The first challenge was acquiring appropriate attire. She could not simply steal one of Aurelia's nightgowns, such a theft would be noticed immediately. But she discovered that items sent to the laundry provided temporary opportunities. By volunteering to assist with the collection and delivery of the Duchess's personal laundry, Fiona gained access to garments during the brief window before they were washed and returned. She selected a nightgown of ivory lace over silk, one of several similar garments Aurelia owned. During the night shift, when the laundry maids had departed and she should have been sleeping, Fiona carefully removed it from the basket and brought it to her own quarters. She would return it to the laundry before dawn, she told herself, making its absence appear to be nothing more than a counting error. But dawn came and the nightgown remained hidden in the back of her wardrobe, wrapped in brown paper to protect it from dust and curious eyes. Fiona told herself she would return it tomorrow, then the day after, then sometime next week. Eventually, she stopped telling herself she would return it at all. The perfume proved easier to acquire. Aurelia kept multiple bottles of her signature jasmine scent, a distinctive blend commissioned from a Parisian perfumer. The Duchess was generous to a fault, often giving away bottles to friends or offering them to guests. Fiona simply claimed that one bottle had been accidentally broken during cleaning, expressing such distress at the loss that Aurelia had immediately forgiven her and thought nothing more of it. That bottle now resided in Fiona's room, tucked behind her few possessions where it waited like a loaded pistol. For the moment she would need it. But acquiring the physical accoutrements was the simplest part of the plan. Far more difficult was perfecting the impersonation itself. Fiona spent her limited free time studying Aurelia with almost scientific precision, noting every gesture, every inflection, every small habit that might distinguish the Duchess from any other woman. Aurelia held her hands in a particular way when she was nervous, fingers laced together at her waist. She tilted her head just slightly to the left when listening intently to someone speak. Her voice softened and dropped in pitch when addressing her husband privately, taking on an intimacy that made Fiona's stomach clench with envy. She moved with a grace born from years of deportment lessons, her spine always straight, her steps measured and deliberate. In the privacy of her tiny room late at night when she should have been sleeping, Fiona practiced these mannerisms before the small cracked mirror that hung on her wall. She rehearsed Aurelia's walk, her gestures, her way of lowering her eyes demurely before raising them to meet another's gaze. She practiced speaking in the soft, breathy tone Aurelia used with the Duke, trying to smooth away the sharper edges of her own accent that betrayed lower-class origins. "Your Grace," she would whisper to her reflection, watching how the candlelight played across features that bore no resemblance to Aurelia's porcelain perfection. "I have returned earlier than expected. Would it work? Could it possibly work?" In darkness, with perfume and lace creating the illusion, with every gesture perfectly calculated to match expectations, might a man see what he wished to see rather than what was truly there? It was a dangerous gamble. But what did Fiona have to lose that she had not already lost by virtue of her birth? Another 40 years of servitude stretched before her, an endless succession of empty days spent dressing and undressing a woman who possessed everything. Fiona would never have. The alternative, to try to reach for something beyond her station through whatever means available, at least offered hope of escape, however faint. She would have everything: security, independence, the satisfaction of watching Aurelia's perfect life crack beneath the weight of this betrayal. Most delicious of all would be the knowledge that the kind, trusting Duchess would spend the rest of her days watching her husband provide for another woman's child, a constant reminder of her own inadequacy and his weakness. The following weeks were spent in meticulous preparation. Fiona began noting the exact hour of Aurelia's Thursday departures, confirming that the Duke indeed spent that time alone in the library. She carefully removed one of the Duchess's nightgowns from the laundry before it reached her chambers, hiding it in the back of her own wardrobe. She even practiced moving with Aurelia's particular grace, studying the way her mistress held her hands, the subtle sway of her walk. Mrs. Brennan observed these preparations without understanding their full purpose, but her unease grew with each passing day. She noted how Fiona's demeanor had changed, how there was now a calculating gleam in those green eyes that spoke of schemes being hatched in darkness. "Something is amiss with that girl," she confided to Mr. Davies, the butler. "Mark my words, she is planning something that will bring trouble to this house." But what could she prove? What could she say beyond vague suspicions that would sound like the fantastical imaginings of an aging servant? She could only watch and wait, her instincts screaming warnings that no one would heed. It was then that fate selected its date for confrontation. The appointed Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though nature itself conspired to make Fiona's plan easier to execute. Throughout the day, Fiona had moved through her duties in a trance-like state, her hands performing familiar tasks, while her mind rehearsed every step of what was to come. She laid out Aurelia's evening clothes with trembling fingers, helped her mistress dress for the charitable visit, and listened with half an ear as the Duchess chattered about Mrs. Miller's improving health. "I do hope I shall not be gone long tonight," Aurelia had said as Fiona fastened her pelisse. "His Grace has promised to read to me from that novel I have been longing to hear. He has such a lovely voice for reading aloud." The casual intimacy of the remark, the easy assumption of her husband's devotion, the simple pleasure taken in his company, sent a fresh wave of bitter envy through Fiona's chest. Soon, she told herself, soon she would know what it meant to be desired by such a man, even if only for one stolen night. Aurelia departed for the village precisely at 7 in the evening, as was her custom, wrapped in the warm pelisse and accompanied by 2 footmen for propriety and safety. Fiona watched from an upper window as the carriage rolled down the long drive, her heart hammering with a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been fear had she allowed herself to acknowledge it. The vehicle grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely beyond the line of trees that marked the estate's boundary. There would be no turning back after tonight. Her entire future hinged on the next few hours. She retreated to her quarters and began her transformation with ritualistic precision. The stolen nightgown slipped over her skin like a second conscience, whispering accusations she refused to hear. The ivory lace clung to her frame in ways that felt both transgressive and thrilling, transforming her from servant into something approaching what she imagined a duchess might be. She unpinned her red-brown hair, letting it fall loosely around her shoulders, in imitation of Aurelia's evening state, arranging it to catch what little light might exist in the dim library. Then came the jasmine perfume, applied so liberally that the scent filled her small room with cloying sweetness, the fragrance seeming to announce her intentions to the very walls themselves. The clock on the mantel in the servants' hall chimed 8 as Fiona made her way through the silent corridors toward the library. The household staff were occupied with their own evening duties, and she encountered no one who might question why a lady's maid was wandering the halls in a nightgown that clearly did not belong to her. It was then that Mrs. Brennan, making her customary evening rounds to ensure all was secure before retiring, spotted a flash of white silk disappearing around a corner. The housekeeper frowned. That had been expensive fabric, not the plain cotton nightdresses servants wore. And was that perfume she smelled? The distinctive jasmine scent that belonged exclusively to the Duchess, every instinct honed by 20 years of service suddenly aligned into a single terrible understanding. Whatever Fiona was planning, it was happening now, and it would end in disaster if not stopped. Mrs. Brennan hurried after the younger woman, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. She watched as Fiona approached the library door, paused to arrange her hair and nightgown more artfully, then pushed it open with trembling hands. The housekeeper positioned herself beside the doorframe, peering through the narrow gap between door and jamb. What she witnessed in the next moments would be seared into her memory forever. The library was indeed dim, lit only by 3 candles on the Duke's massive desk and the dying embers in the fireplace. Damien sat with his back to the door, frowning over a ledger of estate accounts, his mind deeply absorbed in the complex figures before him. He was not merely reading, he was wrestling with a troubling discrepancy in the quarterly rents that demanded his full concentration. He was in his shirt sleeves, his jacket discarded over a nearby chair, completely relaxed in the privacy of his sanctuary, his thoughts miles away from the present moment. Fiona entered silently, moving with studied grace toward the desk. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper, a clever mimicry of intimacy that would mask any slight differences in tone. "Your Grace, I have returned earlier than expected." Damien's head lifted, and though Mrs. Brennan could not see his expression from her angle, she heard the warmth in his voice. "Aurelia, is Mrs. Miller quite well? I did not expect you for another hour at least. She was sleeping peacefully, and I thought—" Fiona moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. "I thought I would rather be with my husband." A cold dread seized Mrs. Brennan. This was far worse than any petty theft or sabotage. This was violation of the most intimate kind, a theft of identity intended to result in consequences that would destroy multiple lives. She watched as the Duke stood and turned, beginning to reach for what he believed was his wife. The jasmine perfume reached him before his eyes could properly focus in the dimness. It was his wife's scent, distinctive and unmistakable. His mind, still half-tangled in ledger numbers and estate concerns, filled in the gaps before logic could intervene. In the dimness, with only candlelight catching on what appeared to be platinum blonde hair, or was it red-brown hair disguised by shadow? And with every expectation telling him Aurelia had returned early, he saw what he wished to see rather than what was truly there. It was then that Mrs. Brennan made her choice. She slammed the library door open with such force that it crashed against the wall, flooding the room with light from the corridor candelabras, banishing the shadows. "Your Grace, that is not Lady Aurelia." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Damien jerked backward as though struck, his arms falling away from the figure before him. He recoiled not merely with surprise, but with a physical revulsion, as if he had touched something impure and cold. His confusion swiftly curdled into icy fury. Fiona spun toward the door, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror as she realized her scheme had been discovered. "Mrs. Brennan?" Damien's voice carried confusion and the first threads of understanding. "What is the meaning of, 'Light every candle in this room immediately, Your Grace,'" the housekeeper commanded with the authority of 2 decades of service. "You must see clearly what deception has been attempted here tonight." Damien moved mechanically, lighting candle after candle until the library blazed with illumination that banished every shadow and revealed every truth. As the light grew, the figure standing before him resolved into sharp focus, and it was decidedly not his wife. Fiona Blackwell stood exposed in all her stolen finery, the jasmine perfume that clung to her skin now seeming more like evidence of crime than seduction. Her red-brown hair, which had appeared blonde in the dimness, now shone with undeniable clarity. Her eyes, so different from Aurelia's gentle blue, stared back at him with increasing panic. "Fiona?" The Duke's voice was barely recognizable, thick with shock and rising fury. "What in God's name—" "I can explain, Your Grace," she began, but her voice trembled with the knowledge that no explanation could suffice. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward, her expression hardened and inflexible. "I shall explain, my lord. I observed this creature leaving the servants' quarters dressed in her Grace's nightgown, a garment no maid would possess honestly. I followed her here and witnessed her attempting to pass herself off as your wife. The jasmine perfume, the intimate address, the darkness she relied upon, all calculated deception." "That is not. I did not." Fiona's protests died as she met the Duke's eyes and saw the terrible comprehension dawning there. "You came here," he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "dressed as my wife, wearing her perfume, in darkness, intending that I should mistake you for Aurelia." It was not a question. The accusation hung in the air between them, as damning as any sentence passed by a court. It was then that the library door opened once more, and Lady Aurelia Grayson entered, still wrapped in her evening pelisse, her face bright with the contentment of charitable work accomplished. "Damien, darling, Mrs. Miller was so much improved that I—" The words died in her throat as she took in the tableau before her, her husband rigid with fury, Mrs. Brennan's inflexible stance as she positioned herself like a guardian between the Duke and the impostor, and Fiona standing in her nightgown, drenched in her perfume, in circumstances that defied innocent explanation. "What?" Aurelia's voice was barely a whisper. "What is happening here?" Damien moved to his wife immediately, placing himself between her and the maid as though to shield her from contamination. "My dear, I am afraid we have discovered a deception most foul." But Aurelia was shaking her head, her eyes fixed on Fiona with desperate denial. No, there must be some mistake. Fiona would never— She is my dearest friend. She is not your friend, milady." Mrs. Brennan's voice was sharp and unyielding. "She has been sabotaging you for months, ruining your gowns, hiding your jewelry, spreading gossip below stairs. Tonight she stole your nightdress and perfume, and came to this library intending to seduce His Grace in darkness, making him believe she was you." "That is absurd," Aurelia said, but her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes were beginning to catalogue the evidence. The nightgown she recognized, the jasmine scent that was uniquely hers clinging to Fiona's skin and hair, the guilty panic written across Fiona's features. The truth was undeniable, written in perfume and stolen silk. It was then that Fiona's careful facade finally shattered. Perhaps it was the knowledge that all was lost, or perhaps it was the sight of Aurelia's wounded confusion, that innocent, trusting face that represented everything Fiona could never have and never be. Whatever the cause, the dam of resentment that had been building for 8 months finally broke with catastrophic force. "Yes!" The word exploded from Fiona's lips like a curse. "Yes, I tried. Are you satisfied now? I tried to take something from you, just as you have everything while I have nothing." Aurelia recoiled as though struck. "Fiona, I have always treated you with kindness." Kindness? Fiona's laugh was sharp and terrible. You call it kindness? This constant display of everything I will never possess? You parade your beauty, your title, your devoted husband before me every single day, while I sleep in a cramped room and earn a pittance. Your kindness is nothing but the charity of a rich woman who has never known want, never understood what it means to have nothing. That does not excuse, Damien began, but Fiona was beyond stopping now. You stand there in your silk gowns and sapphires, calling me your friend as though that makes us equals, as though your condescension erases the fact that your birth gave you everything while mine gave me nothing. You were born to command, and I was born to serve. You have a man who adores you, who would move heaven and earth for your happiness, and you do not even appreciate it. Tears were streaming down Fiona's face now, tears of rage and frustration, and 8 months of consuming jealousy. Finally given voice. I wanted just once to have something you take for granted. One night with a man who might desire me as your husband desires you. One chance to conceive a child who would be my ticket out of servitude. I would have had a cottage, a pension, security for life. And you, she turned on Aurelia with venom. You would have spent every day watching him provide for my child, supporting my comfort, knowing that your precious husband had betrayed you. The cruelty of it, the calculated malice, behind every step of the plan, hung in the air like poison gas. All the blood drained from Aurelia's face. She took an involuntary step backward, as if Fiona's very words were a physical force that had struck her. You hate me so much, she whispered, the question barely audible. After I trusted you, defended you, treated you as what? Fiona spat. As your equal. You never saw me as anything but a servant playing at friendship to ease your loneliness. Your trust was not a gift, it was an insult. Every kindness reminded me of what I could never be. Every compliment was a knife that cut deeper because it came from lips that would never know real suffering. That is enough, Damien's voice severed the tirade with absolute authority. You will leave this house immediately. No references will be provided. You have until dawn to collect your possessions and depart. If you are found on these grounds after sunrise, I will have you arrested for attempted theft and criminal deception. Fiona's defiance crumbled as the reality of her situation penetrated the haze of her rage. Without references, she would be unemployable in any respectable household. Without savings, for what could a lady's maid save? She had nowhere to go but the workhouse, that last refuge of the desperate where paupers labored in brutal conditions for mere survival. Your Grace, please, she whispered, the fight draining from her voice. I have nowhere. You should have considered that before you attempted to violate the sanctity of my marriage and destroy my wife's trust, he replied, his tone absolute. Mrs. Brennan, please see that Miss Blackwell is escorted to her quarters and supervised as she packs. She is to have no contact with any other member of this household. The housekeeper moved forward with grim satisfaction. With pleasure, Your Grace. Come, girl, you have made your bed, now you must lie in it. As Fiona was led from the library, her sobs echoing down the corridor, Aurelia stood frozen in the center of the room, the cloying scent of her own perfume on another woman feeling like the ultimate intimate betrayal. It was then that the full weight of betrayal settled upon her shoulders. I defended her, Aurelia whispered, her voice breaking. Mrs. Brennan tried to warn me, and I dismissed her concerns. I insisted Fiona was trustworthy, that she was my friend. How could I have been so blind? Damien gathered his wife into his arms, holding her as she began to tremble with the shock of realization. You were not blind, my love. You were kind. You have a generous heart that seeks the best in people. That is not a failing. But she hated me, Aurelia said against his chest. All this time she hated me and I never saw it. Every smile was false, every word of concern a lie. How am I to trust anyone again? It was a question that would haunt her in the months to come, as the consequences of Fiona's actions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The next morning, Fiona Blackwell departed Westshire Hall with only a small bag of possessions and the clothes on her back. She walked down the long drive as the sun rose, each step carrying her further from the life she had tried to steal and closer to a future that held only hardship and regret. Without references, she was a social ghost. No respectable household would accept her, for references were the currency of trustworthiness in service. Without connections, and what connections had a lady's maid possessed beyond her position? She had no one to appeal to for assistance. The workhouse was not a choice, it was the only door that remained open to a woman of her station without family, character, or patronage. By the end of the month, cold and desperate, she presented herself at the workhouse in the nearest city. That grim institution where the destitute exchanged their labor for meager sustenance and a roof over their heads. The workhouse was a place where hope went to die. The work was brutal, the food barely sufficient to sustain life, and the conditions so harsh that many who entered never left. Fiona joined the ranks of women who spent 14 hours each day picking oakum or breaking rocks, their hands bleeding, their backs aching, their futures as bleak as the grey walls that imprisoned them. It was the fate she had chosen when she allowed envy to poison her heart and ambition to corrupt her judgment. Meanwhile, at Westshire Hall, the household slowly recovered from the scandal that had nearly destroyed it. Aurelia struggled with the aftermath of betrayal, finding herself unable to extend the easy trust she had once given so freely. She questioned every servant's motive, saw suspicion in every smile, and withdrew into herself in ways that worried both her husband and the loyal Mrs. Brennan. "Milady," the housekeeper said one morning as she found Aurelia staring out the window of her chambers, "you must not let that wicked girl's actions poison your good heart." Aurelia turned, and Mrs. Brennan was startled to see tears on the young Duchess's face. "How am I to know who to trust? I prided myself on my kindness, but it seems my kindness was merely naivete." "There is a difference, milady, between kindness and wisdom," Mrs. Brennan said gently, settling into a chair with the familiarity of long service. "You trusted without discernment, gave your affection without seeing what manner of person received it. That is not kindness. It is desperation for connection masquerading as generosity." The words, though hard, carried truth that Aurelia needed to hear. "True kindness," the housekeeper continued, "is given with open eyes. It sees the person clearly, their virtues and their flaws, and chooses compassion anyway. But it does not blind itself to danger in the name of friendship. It does not confuse loneliness with discernment." "I was so desperate for a friend," Aurelia admitted. "After losing my parents, after being passed from relative to relative like an unwanted burden, I thought if I just treated people well enough, they would love me in return. And some will, milady. Some already do. But you cannot purchase loyalty with kindness, nor demand affection through generosity. Those must be earned through time and proven through trials." Mrs. Brennan reached across and took the younger woman's hand. "I have served this family for 20 years. I loved the old Duchess like a sister, and I have come to care for you as a daughter. That affection is not given lightly or earned through gifts and gentle words. It is built on respect, consistency, and genuine regard." It was then that Aurelia began to understand the distinction between charity and friendship, between kindness given freely and trust earned over time. The healing was slow, measured in small increments of returned confidence. Damien proved himself patient and steadfast, never pressing his wife to recover faster than her heart could manage. When Aurelia, in those first weeks, instinctively recoiled from a new companion's approach, he did not insist or chide. He simply dismissed the woman graciously and sat with Aurelia, reading aloud to her from her favorite novels until the anxiety ebbed from her features. He spent more time at the estate, ensuring she felt secure and protected within their home. Mrs. Brennan became not just a servant, but a confidant, the maternal figure Aurelia had lost in childhood and desperately needed in her young adulthood. The housekeeper taught her how to read people more carefully, how to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated flattery, how to maintain appropriate boundaries while still extending compassion. "You need not become cold or suspicious, milady," she explained one afternoon as they reviewed the household accounts together. "You must simply learn to observe before you trust, to watch how people behave when they think you are not looking, to judge them by their consistency rather than their words. It was a difficult education, transforming Aurelia from the naive girl who had arrived at Westshire Hall into a woman who could navigate the complex relationships of household management with wisdom and discernment. But with each passing month, she grew stronger, more confident, more capable of extending kindness without sacrificing judgment. A year after the night of betrayal, Aurelia stood once more in her private chambers, this time with a very different lady's maid, an older woman named Helen, who had served 3 duchesses before her and whose loyalty had been proven through decades of faithful service. In the nursery down the hall, her son, the heir to Westshire, slept peacefully in his cradle, watched over by a carefully vetted nurse whose references had been exhaustively checked and whose character had been observed over months before being entrusted with such precious responsibility. "Helen," Aurelia said as her maid fastened the clasps on her evening gown, "did you ever hear what became of Fiona Blackwell?" The older woman's expression flickered with something that might have been pity. "She remains in the workhouse, milady. Word reached us through the servants' network. She attempted to leave several times but has nowhere to go. The work there is destroying her health, they say." Aurelia was silent for a long moment, struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of her, the generous part that had once trusted so easily, wanted to offer assistance. But the wiser part, the part that had learned difficult lessons about enabling versus helping, recognized that some consequences must be allowed to run their course. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the kindest thing we can do is allow people to face the results of their choices. Fiona made her decision when she chose hatred over gratitude, vengeance over honest work. If I were to rescue her now, what would she learn? That betrayal carries no lasting consequences, that she can destroy trust and still be rewarded with charity." "You have grown wise, milady," Helen observed. "I have grown realistic," Aurelia corrected. "There is a difference between compassion and foolishness. I can regret her suffering while recognizing that I am not responsible for choices she made freely." It was then that Mrs. Brennan appeared at the chamber door, come to escort Aurelia downstairs for dinner. The housekeeper's expression was warm with approval as she observed the confident woman the young duchess had become. "Are you ready, milady?" she asked. Aurelia took one final look in the mirror, seeing not just her reflection but the person she had become through adversity. Stronger, wiser, still kind, but no longer naive. "I am, Mrs. Brennan." "Thank you for asking." As they descended the grand staircase together, Aurelia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that trust was a gift to be earned, that boundaries were necessary even in kindness, that wisdom and compassion could coexist without contradiction. The great hall of Westshire was warm with candlelight and the presence of people she had come to know truly, servants whose loyalty had been proven over time, neighbors whose friendship had deepened through shared experiences, and most importantly, a husband whose steadfast devotion had never wavered even in the darkest moments. This was what real belonging felt like, not the desperate grasping at connection she had once mistaken for friendship, but the solid foundation of relationships built on mutual respect and genuine regard. "Shall we discuss the arrangements for the Christmas ball?" Mrs. Brennan asked as they walked. "It will be your first time hosting the estate's traditional celebration." "I should like that very much," Aurelia replied, then smiled. "And Mrs. Brennan, I wonder if you might consider standing as godmother to the baby when we have him christened. You saved more than my marriage that night. You saved me from my own blindness. I can think of no one I trust more completely." The older woman's eyes glistened with emotion, and she reached out to squeeze Aurelia's hand. "I should be honored beyond measure, milady." As they entered the dining room where Damien waited, his face lighting with pleasure at the sight of his wife, Aurelia felt the last pieces of her heart settle into place. She had learned the hardest lessons about trust and betrayal, about kindness and wisdom, and had emerged not broken but refined. Fiona's betrayal had been meant to destroy her, but instead it had forged her into someone stronger, someone capable of extending genuine compassion without sacrificing discernment. The girl who had arrived at Westshire Hall desperate for any connection had become a woman who understood that true relationships were built on honesty and proven through time. She took her seat at the table, surrounded by people she had learned to trust completely, not because she was naive, but because she had observed them carefully and found them worthy. The candlelight danced across the faces of those she loved, and for the first time since that terrible night in the library, she felt completely at peace. The lesson had been hard, but she had learned it well. Kindness without wisdom was merely foolishness, but wisdom without kindness was cruelty. It was then that she realized the most important truth of all. The person Fiona had hated and tried to destroy had never truly existed. That perfect, naive girl who trusted blindly and gave without discernment had been an illusion born of loneliness and desperation. The real Aurelia, the woman she was becoming, was far more resilient, far more capable, and far more worthy of the life she had built. And somewhere in the workhouse, breaking rocks with bleeding hands, Fiona Blackwell learned her own terrible lesson. That envy was a poison that destroyed the one who harbored it, long before it ever touched its intended victim.